We've talked about art in Catholic countries in the 17th century. And now I want to talk about art in a Protestant country. And we often talk about the Dutch Baroque. This is the North Netherlands, of course. By the 17th century, you'll remember the lowlands were divided into two countries. The north was the Kingdom of the Netherlands, ruled by the House of Orange, William of Orange. You've probably heard of him. And we often use the adjective Dutch, although it's a misnomer. It comes from Deutsch, which means German, but it's a misnomer that we use in English a lot, to refer to the North Netherlands. The South Netherlands is Flanders. Flemish is our adjective for that. And it is still ruled by Spain. So after the religious war has run its course, in the late 16th century, there is a new kingdom, which is the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Flanders remains under Spanish rule. Well, we now start talking about the Netherlands. Now, this is something that's important for the exams. You can't talk about Rubens as being from the Netherlands. You have to talk about Rubens as being from Flanders, because we have a whole separate country now that is the Netherlands. So be aware of that. The Dutch artists, Rembrandt, Hals, Leyster, Vermeer, Ruisdael, various people we're going to talk about. You'll have to distinguish in the 17th century, you need to distinguish between the Flemish artists and the artists of the Netherlands, which before we would say the North Netherlands to distinguish it. Okay, here's the Kingdom of the Netherlands. What characteristics do they have? Well, they are a Protestant country. The state religion is Dutch Reform. It's a Calvinist church. But unlike many of the Catholic areas, or even some of the Protestant areas, they do not persecute minority religions. So one of the interesting things is that the Netherlands has a lot of people who are not Dutch Reform. You do have Catholics. You have Mennonites. You have Jews. And they are not being persecuted, even though you do have a state religion. And that is very unusual, even in history. The Netherlands are a prosperous mercantile economy. It's a very capitalistic economy. They invest in various ways of making money. They have ships that go out and bring merchandise, unfortunately, including the slave trade. They have fisheries. They have just very hardworking people. You've got dairy farmers, and a lot of things that we do still think of the Netherlands as having a lot of seafood and a lot of cheese. This is long. It's right on the land. You actually have to reclaim land from the sea because it is the lowlands. Now, they had a very prosperous middle class. People who weren't necessarily aristocrats, but had more than enough money to live on. So a prosperous middle class. And these people became the patrons of the arts in the 17th century. And so sometimes we do say that the Baroque art of the Netherlands reflects certain middle class values in a sense. One of those values, of course, if your state religion is Protestant and your church, the Dutch Reformed Church, is Calvinist, that's an iconoclastic church. Calvin was totally opposed to religious art. And they had a period when people would go into the churches, the iconoclasts would go into the churches and destroy the religious art. They would burn the religious art. So you had a lot left religious art surviving in the North Netherlands. And what were your artists of the 17th century to paint? Well, they do still paint religious art because not all religious art is meant to be worshipped, iconic. You might see new subjects such as something you see both places, but you see things like the parable of the prodigal son. Nobody's going to worship the parable of the prodigal son. It's a parable. It's didactic. It teaches you about a story that Jesus told. It has a point. But we do see less religious art being made and more secular art. Secular meaning not religious art. So the opposite of sacred art. And we see new secular subjects coming to the forefront. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We know that there was some painting on speculation in earlier centuries. For example, we know that carved wooden altarpieces were often sold in the marketplace in Antwerp in the 16th century. But I think almost all, if not all, of the paintings that we have seen so far in this course were painted on commission. You know, the artist doesn't just paint something and hope somebody would like it and would buy it. You don't paint the Ghent altarpiece or the Lives of Marie de Medici, for that matter, and just hope someone will buy them. You're spending years of your life on it and a great quantity of money because paint is expensive. And so the artist will not start a project like that unless he's sure he will be paid. But the art market's changing in the Dutch Baroque period. As we'll see, there's new subjects that appeal to the middle class. And more and more artists are painting on speculation. In other words, they paint something that is generic enough that they hope that somebody will buy it. And where do they sell their work? Well, they could sell them out of their workshop, of course, but there actually are markets. Like, you know, you go to the open air market to buy your food, but you can also go to an open air market to buy your paintings. And some paintings were indeed sold in the marketplace. It also is the beginning of the rise of art dealers. There became people who were essentially salesmen for sometimes their own work, but also for other artists' work. We'll see that the artist Vermeer was an art dealer. He sold his own work and he sold other people's works. And it's a period of artistic specialization. Artists want to be known for painting a particular kind of picture, so there'll be a demand for that. And obviously, the specialization is something they believe there will be a demand for. So you do see artists who specialize in, say, landscapes or still lifes. There are, of course, other artists who paint a number of subjects. And Rembrandt, for example, is one of those. There are artists who specialize. There are artists who paint nothing but landscapes. There's even subdivision. There was an artist who specialized in painting skating scenes, and another several actually, who painted the interior of buildings, such as churches or occasionally a synagogue. They painted things that they thought people would like to buy. And so we have what we call, and I'm putting it in quotations, new subjects that appeal to the middle class. Now, when I say new, I don't mean they've never been seen before in the history of art. The Romans practiced all of these types of subjects. And you start seeing bits and pieces of them, in a sense, in the Renaissance. You have the landscape in the background of the Mona Lisa. You might have still life objects such as those that surround the French ambassadors in Holbein's French Ambassadors, portrait of the two French ambassadors. You might see a genre scene, but that's fairly rare. Remember we talked about Artemisia Gentileschi drawing her brother and painting her sisters doing everyday activities. Now, what we see is the rise and becoming a very important part of the subjects of of the 17th century, landscapes, seascapes, in other words, views of nature, vistas. In the Renaissance, the landscapes are usually just the background, with human beings dominate. Here's the Mona Lisa, and she dominates. She's the largest form right up in the foreground. But then in the background, you have this landscape. Now, in Baroque landscapes, these are independent subjects. It doesn't have to be the background of a portrait or the background of a Bible scene or something like that. Nature dominates, and you can have very, very small human beings, or even in some cases, no human beings at all. So let's look at an example of that. Jacob van Ruisdael is one of the best known landscape painters in the Dutch Baroque period. And this is a picture of his hometown. He is from Haarlem. And so it's a view of Haarlem, and you can just call it a view of Haarlem. Your text is calling it a view of Haarlem from the dunes at Overveen. And so, really placing it where it is. This is reclaimed land. The Dutch are great engineers. They actually are able to reclaim lands from the sea and place dikes around them so that the land is not flooded. I've also seen this called a view of Haarlem from the drying fields, because that's what's going on in the foreground. They've got a lot of cloth manufacturing. And you have these huge lengths of cloth which are stretched out to be dried in the foreground. And in the background, you see the Church of St. John in Haarlem. It's rising up over this very, very flat landscape. This is the Netherlands. It's flat. It's low land. One thing I want you to notice is how about, 2/3 of the picture is clouds. It's sky. And this is something that a lot of times when we're looking at pictures, we're just used to, what's in the picture? What objects on Earth? But realize that those cloud formations are a major part of the picture. One thing that Ruisdael does, he probably has the most dramatic cloud formations in Baroque art. And there are these great cumulus clouds. They often come in at the diagonals, so you can find some diagonals here. It's interesting. I just noticed the cloud in the middle does seem to have a sort of pinnacle coming up at the top, almost triangular, that sort of repeats the shape of the church a little bit. I mean, obviously, it's much more amorphous. But there are Ruisdael's dramatic clouds. So even if the landscape is quiet and still, and that is something you see in Dutch Baroque art, it's not always dramatic and bombastic. It's very often very quiet, very still, and yet you can have your drama in your clouds in the sky. Another subject that is extremely important is the stilleven, or as we say, the still life. The French say nature morte, or dead nature. I kind of like still life better. These are paintings of inanimate, or sometimes dead, objects. And they didn't always, say still life. They called them by different names. For example, there were Blumenstück, flower pieces, and there were what we see here, a breakfast piece, and there were game pieces. These are, by game they mean the dead animals. And as we'll see, some of these contain, some of them were made to be vanitas images, and some of them subtly contain a certain moral meaning that we'll discuss. Well, first, let's look at this breakfast piece, still life with a Tazza, and that is the metal-worked, very elaborate metal plate, as it were, up on a pedestal that's here on its side and forming a kind of diagonal movement and showing how well he can do foreshortening. And so you have the wonderful crusty rolls for breakfast. They haven't been having oysters or something, but they've got the lemon with its curving peel. And you see a lot of round objects, the bread, the dish of olives, the dish with the the lemon the lemon and its peel, the Tazza, the beautiful glass goblet itself. Within the goblet, you'll see reflections of the room around them, the windows. So this is, in a sense, a continuation of the verisimilitude of Jan van Eyck. Now, it's not always the tiny little details that we see in Van Eyck. They're painting more broadly. But they're very interested in some of the same things, such as the reflection of light off different surfaces. Only here, instead of being part of a religious picture, the still life becomes the entire picture. Now, middle-class people who are wealthy enough to, have extra money will buy interior furnishings, and it's a status symbol to be able to buy your paintings, and you want to have something that's got to do with your life. So, if you're from Haarlem, maybe a nice view of Haarlem will do, or maybe you just want to show all these beautiful vessels which you either have or hope to have in your household. So you paint a lovely still life. One of the earliest still life painters, we don't know who was the first person to paint a painting without any people or any excuse besides the objects, but one of the early ones was Clara Peeters. Now, she is not Dutch, she is Flemish, so she's from the Catholic Baroque area, but since I'm talking about still lifes, I thought I would put her in here. I'm sort of moving her into this section. But do remember that she is Flemish. It's not only the North Netherlands, it's also the South Netherlands who paints pictures. But remember, the South Netherlandish artists could continue to paint religious paintings for Catholic audience. So here we have this still life with fruit and flowers from from a woman artist. That's another thing that's interesting. There seem to be a number of women artists painting still lifes, particularly in the North Netherlands, but here also in Flanders. And one of the reasons is it's perfectly proper for a woman to stay in her house and set up, something to paint. Paint flowers, paint fruit. You don't have to go out and study nude figures or something questionable like that. So we do have a number of female artists who are painters of still lifes. And Clara Peeters, of course, is one of the very earliest. One of the things they're showing, of course, are all the different textures, all the different surfaces, basket weaving, polished metal. Incidentally, in that picture is a reflection, sort of fuzzy, but it's not just a reflection of the window, which you may be able to see, but there's also a reflection of the artist painting, and she does that sometimes. She'll include her portrait in a very sketchy little way. So we have all of these different fruits, flowers, objects, and she shows how masterfully she can paint each of these. In this you have particularly the repetition of curving forms, the vessels themselves, the basket, the pitcher, the goblets, the fruit, the grapes, So there is that repetition of shape, but a great variety of visual interest in the different textures. There may also be symbolic meaning. The Protestants may not have wanted, altarpieces of the crucifixion, for example. But they did want things that showed their moral probity. So here you could have a work of art that shows you, objects in the world, and yet it could have a second meaning. This is a subtle vanitas picture. There are many pictures that are very obviously vanitas pictures. They usually have skulls in them. But this one's a little more subtle. So first I want to explain what a vanitas image is, and then point out some of the symbolic objects, as it were. Vanitas refers to, it's the Latin for vanity. And of course the word vanity can have a lot of different meanings. In this case, it refers to almost a refrain, a repeated verse in Ecclesiastes. And in it, the writer of Ecclesiastes talks about all the things in the world. And then afterwards he will say, "Vanity, vanity, all is vanity." And even great study is a weariness, he says. "Vanity, vanity, all is vanity." The idea is all these things on earth, all these worldly things, good food, sex, money, power, even study, is short-lived. Life is short. And you're soon going to die. And what can you take with you? Well, remember, this is a Christian society. So they would say that all of these worldly things are in vain. You can amass the greatest fortune in the world, but when you die, God isn't going to say, by the way, can you pay your way into heaven? In fact, that may be held against you. You can be the most powerful person in your area, but that power doesn't get you into heaven. Spiritual things get you into heaven, not worldly things. So it refers to the brevity of life, that all worldly things are in vain, hence vanitas, hence they are vanities. Things that just don't last. They seem really important at the time, but in the big picture, they're not very important. So what's that got to do with this picture? I mean, yes, it's things of the world, but, there doesn't seem to be any condemnation here. It doesn't say, like, you shouldn't be allowed to eat fruit because, you're just going to die. I mean, you have to eat something. Why not fruit? But if we look closer, we can see, for example, the flowers are past their prime. They're full-blown. Some of them are losing petals. They're sort of leaning over, drooping down. Fruit, and I don't know about this picture, but sometimes you can get really close and you can see the fruit is just starting to rot. It may have little brown spots on it. I'm not sure that this fruit does. But we do know that fruit will not last very long. So those are things that have a short lifespan, even shorter than human life, but they are symbolic of the brevity of human life. The flower that wilts. And there's a little grasshopper down below the flower vase and a little bug climbing up it. Insects also have a very short life. So they refer to the brevity of human life. Now, down in the lower right, there are coins. The coins help to date the picture because they actually can date those coins, which shows you, once again, the verisimilitude, the fact that they are very, very naturalistic. It could refer to the wealth of the patron who would be buying this painting. But I think in the context of the other objects, it's more likely a reference to worldly vanity. All that money isn't going to help you when you die and you want to go into heaven rather than hell. And of course, we also mentioned that the artist, Clara Peeters, has left a fuzzy little self-portrait of herself as a reflection in the picture. This is another painting by Clara Peeters. This one's in Madrid. When they name these things, they usually call them still life with, and then they start listing everything in the picture. And that makes a long, long list. So I'm just going to say that this is a still life with pretzels, because pretzels are a little bit unusual in still lifes. They made pretzels in the lowlands, and they have very elaborate curving forms. And if you look at this, you have different vessels of different material. You have clay, stoneware, porcelain perhaps, and then different metals. And right out front, you have this very elaborate beaker with nodes on it. And there's a little circular shapes that come out, which does this beaker does appear a number of times in Clara Peeters' work. And here you can see that same picture that we saw before. This seems to be a play between vertical, so we have the vertical beaker in the foreground and the vessel with the flowers and then the pitcher and that glass of wine in the background. And then you have the circular objects, some of which are low, like the dish of nuts and fruit and the pretzels and the pretzel dish. And of course some of the shapes of the flowers are also circular shapes. So there's a nice geometry to it. Now, we're going to jump. I thought I would show you some women artists. Most of the still life artists, most of the artists of any type were male. But, I'm showing you just a few examples of still life, so I thought I would show you some things by women artists because they did start to participate in this. Rachel Ruysch was the daughter of a naturalist, a scientist, and I should mention that scientific knowledge is becoming much more important in the 17th century. At any rate, Ruysch's father was a naturalist, and she sometimes does put in what I call creepy crawlies, different bugs, snails, sometimes even reptiles. There's one with a snake and one which is a very beautiful still life with a little lizard in the Pitti Palace. And perhaps some of her interest in nature came from her father, but certainly she made it her own. Now, she had quite a long lifespan. She is from the Netherlands, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the North Netherlands. She's Dutch Baroque. And she does paint work in the 17th century, but she lives into the 18th century. So this particular picture that we're looking at is actually early 18th century. It's sometime after 1700. She's very famous for painting. I mentioned the little creepy crawlies she includes, but she paints flowers, sometimes fruit too. But flowers is what she does the most, and flowers is what she is famous for. The Blumenstück, the flowers pieces. Now, something that's interesting is that flower pieces were the most expensive. They were the still lifes for which you received the most money. You were best paid if you were a flower painter. So there's certainly an incentive to paint flowers. You may know that the Netherlands is a place where they love flowers. They're where they develop the tulip and all these exotic varieties, and they have hothouses and. They do love the flowers. In fact, much earlier than this, but during the 16th century, much earlier than this, but during the 17th century, 1600s, there was a boom in the tulip market, and people were literally paying fortunes for, or at least small fortunes, for rare tulip bulbs. There was speculation in the market. Does this sound familiar? Maybe not tulip bulbs, but it's the same thing as say the stock market. Essentially, they're investing in tulips, and the market fell out. The people couldn't get those high prices anymore, and people went bankrupt from the downfall of the tulip market. I tell you the story just to let you know how important, not only aesthetically and just because they like flowers, but also even economically, flowers are to the Dutch. So flower painters were the best remunerated of all the still life painters, quite handsomely, I understand. And so this is what Rachel Ruysch specializes in. She's also known for these still lifes, such as you see here. This is one in the Museum of Art in Toledo, Ohio. And you notice the whole thing seems to have a kind of diagonal movement. And she's known for these diagonals and also, which makes it a very dramatic flower. I mean, you can just have flowers that sit there, but these seem to have really a movement to them. And you can see that some of them are sort of falling out of the floral arrangement and are curving down. So you have, once again, these very dramatic flowers. And let's look a little closer. Oh, what do you know? We have all sorts of little different insects here. We have some flies. There's also some snails in here. I don't think you see them in this picture, but there are different insects among the flowers. Well, you'll notice that the blossoms here are past their prime. They're full blown. They're drooping. They're losing their petals. So, the flowers are dying. So will you. And then there was the insect life, which refers once again to the brevity of human life and the presence of decay, mortal decay. I think in this there may be some, I believe there are some, there's a little ladybug, but I think there's a fly here. But I also think that somewhere in this painting there are also butterflies. And butterflies sometimes are a more hopeful insect because sometimes they are seen as a symbol of the soul, which they can... fly off. So this is a vanitas flower piece, referring to the brevity of human life, as well as the beauty of the flowers. I should also tell you that the flower pictures, it wasn't that the artist set them up and painted just what they saw, because frequently in flower images you'll have flowers that bloom at different times. They couldn't possibly put them together in one picture. So these people really know exactly what these different types of flowers are. They can all be identified by people who know different types of flowers, by naturalists, by botanists. And so, the authenticity was of course prized, but the arrangements can be imaginary. You can put things together that are not actually existing at the same time, because of course these people were very skilled in painting them, and they could add the flowers they wanted to. The third of these new subjects, landscape, still life, and then what we call genre or genre painting. Now, this word is a little bit of a misnomer. The word genre simply means sort, kind. And somehow, maybe they used to say, this was a particular genre of painting, a particular kind of painting. It got applied to one particular kind, which is the paintings of everyday activities. We have ordinary people doing ordinary things. And I'm showing you here two paintings by artists we're going to talk about just very shortly. One is a painting by Judith Leyster, in which you have, a man and his wife, or a man and his girlfriend, whoever, enjoying a glass of wine. It's a merry company. They're smiling. They're happy. Everyday activities. And over here is the maidservant or the cook who is pouring milk. And this is a painting by Vermeer. So these are two genre painters we're going to talk about. The first genre painter we're going to talk about is Judith Leyster. And we're seeing her here in her self-portrait. She's the very image of a successful woman artist. She's poised, she's self-confident. It looks like we've come into her studio and sort of interrupted her at her work, but she's going to be very gracious about it. She's turned around and smiling at us, has her mouth open as though she's about to speak to us, to welcome us. It's a pose of a moment. And of course, this is one of the things we say, that often in Baroque art, you have a kind of slice of life or a momentary pose that is going to change in another minute, presumably, if this were real and she could get up and move. Now, I mentioned that she was the very model of a successful woman artist. They did have a number of women artists. It was becoming more possible for a woman to be an artist in 17th century Netherlands. And most of them were still life painters. Judith Leyster is pretty much an exception. She is a successful woman artist who paints people. She paints people. She also does paint some still lifes, but she predominantly paints people and is known for her genre painting. So this is her self-portrait. She is indeed painting a genre painting. She's painting a merry musician, a fiddler here. He's smiling, and she's very well known for painting smiles, which is harder to do than painting frowns. It really is. So she's painting this smiling figure with a lot of life and vim and vigor. We can also see that she wears very elegant garments, not the garments of an aristocrat particularly, but it looks like she's wearing her Sunday best, as we would say it. I don't know whether they actually reserved better clothes. The clothes were part of your image. Today you might have a millionaire wearing jeans, farmer's clothes. But back then, no, you wouldn't do that. You want to show what your social status is. So even though she's at work, she's shown wearing these transparent cuffs. I mean, very hard, sort of an expensive piece of clothing because the fabric would have to be so very fine. And then there is the lace work. And of course, in the Netherlands, both in Flanders and in the North Netherlands, they're very famous for their lace. And she has this very fine ruff, which was high fashion at the time, a little, we say, Dutch cap, which is translucent on her head. And, the lace, which is, it's a luxury to have lace, but she certainly does. So this shows her social status. It shows that she's successful. She also paints with a very painterly style, very, very free brushwork, as you can see here. The picture of her hand and the palette and her brushes and her painting cloth, just very, very freely painted. She later on, when this very freedom of paint was not as, it wasn't what was the in thing, she modified her style to paint more smoothly. So she very much was an artist who was very active and aware of what her patrons would want, and she was quite successful. We now want to talk about Jan Vermeer. Vermeer is one of the most wonderful genre painters. He is from the Netherlands. Interestingly enough, this is not something I'm going to ask you about, but just a point of interest, he is Catholic. And he painted a couple of religious pictures, I think 3 that I know of. One could have been a Protestant religious picture. It's Christ with Mary and Martha. The other one is an allegory of religion, which is definitely Catholic, and a saint. But for the most part, he didn't paint his religion. He painted subjects of everyday life. He is a genre painter. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about what he's known for, obviously painting genre paintings. Many of these paintings have a kind of geometry about them. Some of the points that I'm going to be making, the geometry, the repetition of shapes, the still, quiet mood, and then we want to talk about his use of light and his possible an interest in a scientific device, as it were, in optics. So here we're looking at one of his pictures, The Woman with a Balance, in the National Gallery in Washington. And you'll see the mood is still and quiet. The light shines through the window. It seems to be late afternoon, and it shines on her, and you have little reflection of light picking up the jewelry on her table and on her face and the edge of her veil. So he's very well known for painting this diffuse light that gives a still, quiet mood. And oftentimes you can tell what time of day it is from it. Also, there is this geometry. I think it's Gombrich, Ernst Gombrich, who calls Vermeer's pictures still lifes of human beings. In other words, the people are very quiet, very still. This is the opposite of what we think of as the Baroque, very, very bombastic, but it is 17th century. So it's a different face of the Baroque, which is showing verisimilitude. It has been suggested that he used a camera obscura, which was a new optical device. And here you see it in a 19th century picture. Essentially, it's a brownie box camera. Now, probably most of you don't know about brownie box cameras, but before there were digital cameras, before there were even Instamatics, there was a little camera that was marketed for people. I had one back in the 1950s, which essentially was a box with a mirror on it, a box with a lens on it and a mirror, and it's pretty much like this, except you would wind film into it and the film would be exposed. So this is essentially a very simple camera, a brownie box camera, if you will, without film. And the light would enter into the box through the lens. It would be reversed. So to reverse it, you have a mirror inside, and it reflects up through a piece of glass here onto another mirror, which reflects it down. And here you can see this guy sort of tracing his image. Well, Vermeer does a lot more than trace. I still am just amazed the way he treats light. But it may be that he had an interest in optics and was interested in using, maybe not for everything, but experimenting with that. And here's one of the examples of works of art where this was from an article by Charles Sterling, where he tries to prove that Vermeer used a camera obscura. Here's a little painting known as The Girl in a Red Hat. And you can see down here in the lower right, there is a photograph of a lion's-headed finial, which you see here on the piece of furniture in the painting, and we have a detail sort of blowing up. And if you blow up that lion's head finial, or if you look really closely at it, you see what seems to be diffuse circles of light. These appear when you're looking through a camera obscura. They're called circles of confusion. And here you see he found one of these, the author found one of these lion-headed finials and took a photograph of it through the camera obscura. Oh, he's viewing it through the camera obscura, and you can see these globules of light, these sort of amorphous circles. And you do see something very, very much like that in Vermeer's paintings. So this is the evidence, perhaps.